In a small Wyoming town, two sheriffs vanished on the very same night in 1983. Men everyone trusted, swallowed by silence without leaving a trace. For decades, their absence became both a wound and a rumor, a story people whispered, but never resolved. Then, 27 years later, during an ordinary renovation at the old local bar, workers uncovered a sealed barrel beneath the floorboards. And inside, something that forced Riverton to reopen its past. What happened to those men? And why was the truth buried where no one was meant to find it? November 1983 laid a thin frost over Riverton, turning the Wind River into a slow blue ribbon, and making every hinge in town speak in the voice of a tired uncle. Inside the Buck and Rail Saloon, the air carried stove heat and patient smoke. Sawdust dark with boot prints mapped the evening like a hand-drawn atlas, and the jukebox scraped a tune so familiar it felt inherited. Tobacco lived in the curtains, beer made little suns on the oak, and the door let the rivers whisper in. Two hats rose above the crowd, the way chapel spires rise above roofs. Harlan Crow, mustache disciplined, habitually straightened anything that hung crooked. He pressed his palm to a picture frame until it squared with the wall and with the oath he carried. In his breast pocket, a notebook softened by years kept fragments of verse he would never read aloud. He chewed sunflower seeds as if patience could be eaten and tucked the shells into his hand because his mother taught him that floors remember. Beside him stood Jack Teller, who removed his hat at every threshold as if greeting the room before speaking, who rubbed his star with the cuff of his sleeve until it caught the light like a small sunrise. He had a quiet face that seemed to arrive a few seconds before his words, a way of listening that made men finish their sentences, and the posture of someone raised to believe that decency requires ceremony. They were why the town breathed easier. That night, Marcus Hawley, seller of powders and dread, slept in a cell, and for once mothers let their daughters walk home from choir without counting footfalls behind them. Ruth Delgado reigned behind the bar with a knife bright as gossip, cutting lemons into moons and announcing that when the devil finally pays his tab, he tips in coins. The room laughed. Glasses clinked. Harlan and Jack lifted theirs in a shy toast, not triumphal, only grateful. The way men drink when they have seen victories on Not Later. Silas McCready, the owner who spoke more with his shoulders than his mouth, kept slipping down to the cellar and returning with bottles foggy from the cold. Every time the door opened, a breath of damp came up. Apple hulls that had never been stored there, the fatigue of barrels, the slow perfume of years. The sign outside creaked and made a low chapel note. Pastor Ezekiel Ward arrived in his coat and advised the room the way pastors do when they want the world to turn slower. Some truths, he said, should be told in winter, when hearts can hold them without melting. A young woman with a Polaroid asked for a picture. The hats tipped toward one another. The flash cracked like ice, and the square slid out with the confidence of a small miracle. Ruth fanned it under the ceiling fan and claimed the little box had better memory than most men. Jack smiled and set his hat back at the angle his father had taught him. Enough shadow for humility, enough light for honesty. Harmless details stitched themselves into a seam. Harlan went to the cellar to get air, which made Ruth laugh because no one gets air in a basement. He came back with hands scrubbed pink and asked, half embarrassed, if she kept rosin, the sticky brick used by violinists, because cellar smell clings. She found a dusty block in a drawer with bottle openers and old coins. When he turned to go, she noticed a thin kiss of tar on the edge of his boot. He noticed a photograph on the wall hanging askew and could not help himself. He straightened it with a quick priestly touch. Jack told the story of the arrest as if reading the weather. Marcus blinked at the cuffs. A boy was spared. The door closed. No swagger, only verbs. The bar rewarded him with a round he did not want but accepted, because refusing would have looked like pride. Outside, The river pressed its wet palm against the banks, and the wind ran a comb through the cottonwoods. Near midnight, the celebration thinned the way a river thins against gravel. Harlan adjusted the picture he had already straightened, as if checking that his touch still worked. Jack thanked Ruth, tipped too much, and told Silas to sleep. They stepped out the back door into blue cold that gathered around them like a shawl. Their shadows crossed the yard where crates and kegs made a short maze. Beyond the fence a pair of headlights idled, then drifted toward the Fremont Bridge and into the kind of darkness that looks like privacy from the outside and absence from within. Some said one engine started. Others swore two. A farm dog barked once toward the bridge and then reconsidered. The town, which had felt so sturdy, now held a loose window that would not stop rattling. Ruth washed the last glass by hand, though the machine worked fine, doing a thing slowly. Can't keep a night from ending too quickly. She wiped a black smudge from the floor, slipped the rosin back where it could be ignored, and told herself the partners would be home before the coffee cooled on their kitchen counters. Morning arrived, with its usual lack of imagination: coffee, frost, a school bell, the mail truck. It took until noon for absence to speak its name. Harlan's porch chair kept its thin glaze of ice. Jack's hat peg leaned without a hat. Calls went out. Patrols doubled back. Rumor jogged along Main and stopped in knots. Someone had seen headlights. Pause near the bridge. Someone else had seen nothing at all, which in a small town often means the same thing. The wind refused to return what it had been trusted to hold. By evening, searchers had walked the banks until their ankles ached, and their flashlights made fog into coins. Nothing rose. The wind kept its counsel. Ruth counted the till slow and put the money in its envelope like putting a day to bed. She watered the ferns in the window and watched the glass cloud with their gratitude. She stacked clean tumblers mouth down as if they were letters sealing themselves. Memory began to work the night like a seamstress who does not trust daylight. Years move in their own boots, but they deliver the same dust. Another spring found the buck and rail with new paint and the old floor still remembering where people liked to stand. Workmen arrived with hammers and chalk lines and the optimism of men paid by the hour. Led by Noah McCready, Silas's nephew returned to make the floor honest. They pried up squares of plank near the back wall. The room exhaled a buried chill, the cellar's apple breath, the fatigue of barrels, the mineral hush of time, and from the hole below came the round shoulder of a sealed cask, lids pinned down with resin glazed to amber. The lid gave, not all at once, but the way a secret finally does, with a weary crack and a breath from the depths. Darkness waited inside with the confidence of something allowed to wait a long time. Dust rose in a slow column, as if a small weather woke underground. The men forgot their tools, and the fan upstairs held its breath, listening for a name that might rise and deciding to keep the silence. The lid did not open so much as unfasten the past. Resin cracked like sugar on a burnt crane and let out a breath from years no one remembered breathing. Inside the cask lay 2 patrol hats nested the way patient bowls might rest in a cupboard, their bands dusty with the color of unlit mornings. Between them, tilted slightly as if listening, a golden star waited. Its points kept a small stubborn shine even under the gray film of cellar weather. Ancient dust rose, perfumed with wood and iron. The interior walls were painted with a thick amber glaze of rosin that had glassed over time. It smelled faintly of pine and stage curtains and something else, like a truth that had been warmed and cooled until it forgot its name. Noah McCready, hammer still in his belt, put both hands on his knees and could not think of anything wise to say. He only said a name the town had avoided for decades, and it sounded to him like apologizing to a room. Others came near with the cautious curiosity people use for beehives and miracles. Ruth Delgado stood back, her bar towel held like a flag. Surrendered. And in her face, the years rearranged themselves until the night of '83 looked close enough to touch. They asked for help, and help arrived with lights that made the old wood blink. Maeve Rio stepped over the boards with the measured grace of someone used to speaking softly to rooms that might lie. She wore a field coat the color of rain and a little pin shaped like a mug. She collects the mugs of county fairs, she said, because they hold stories even when empty. Behind her, Dr. Hal Wexler carried a kit and a grin that had injured many metaphors. He greeted the cask like a patient. At last, a case of heartwood, and then, because sorrow had settled in, he promised to keep the rest of his puns in recovery. Procedures wrapped the space in careful tape, and the kind of silence that makes explanations make sense. Maeve logged what eyes could see: 2 hats browned by sleep, 1 star, the lap and glitter of rosin, a black glaze at the bottom that looked like tar. She did not touch until the technicians had made their maps and numbers. Then she lifted the star with tweezers and turned it like a page. On the back, scratched with something harder than confession, a sentence that carried heat. Per the name, J. The letters were rough, desperate, and shallow in places where the hand must have trembled. Maeve felt how certain phrases make the ribs wider and the throat smaller. Wexler read it low and whistled, then tried not to say anything witty, because grief has a way of subtracting oxygen from humor. Noah closed his eyes, as if the name written there could hear him say sorry for finding it. News moves fastest in towns where nothing happens. By afternoon, there were vans nosed crooked along Main, and a thicket of microphones that looked like bristled seed heads. Ruth polished the front bar until it reflected the ceiling fans like slow rivers. Silas's portrait over the register watched without comment. Maeve chose to meet the questions here, in the room that knew the most and gossiped the least. She spoke plainly. An old cask in the floor, 2 hats, 1 star. The words on the back were shown on a board, steady and unavoidable. People swallowed as if the air had seeds in it. The phrase bruised the town in a single place, the way a thrown stone bruises fruit. The first task, she told them, was to sort memory from rumor, and rumor from what the world can be made to prove. Names were placed gently on the table, as if they might crack. Ruth, who closed the bar that cold night at 2:14, had a gas receipt stamped 228. She kept it not because she expected history to demand evidence, but because she organizes her wallet like a sermon. Claudine Vega, sister to Marcus Halley, said she had been at a hospital in Casper, sitting her mother's fever. The emergency log remembered her. Franklin Cordell of the scrapyard claimed victory at the St. Bridget bingo that same night. The prize, 1 stubborn toaster, still slept in its box with tape older than apologies. Pastor Ezekiel Ward admitted he had spoken to Harlan outside the bar before midnight. His watch had been repaired that evening at 11:12, a fact he carried like a verse. And there was Sully Parmenter, dock watchman, who knew when trucks woke and when they pretended to sleep. Maeve did not accuse. She built, as carpenters do, a frame that could hold weight. She sent pairs of deputies to knock on doors, to pull old receipts, to stand in sunlight and take down the story exactly as it had been told before the sun arrived. She asked Wexler about the varnish inside the cask. He scraped a grain and nodded. Rosin, he said, the powder violin bows hunger for spread thick to seal smell and damp. And this tar? Pitch, likely from roof work, heavy as regret. If you wanted a thing to stop talking, this is how you would quiet it. Ruth brought coffee to the table because there are scenes that require a human temperature. Wexler sniffed, sipped, and observed that the town had kept a secret in a major key. Ruth set her mug down as if putting away a scalpel. Good secrets, she said, go out of tune. A small laugh moved through the room like a moth. Even grief permits small lights when they do not ask for credit. Noah explained the renovation to anyone who would listen. How the floor had a tired sway, how chalk lines laid true where the joists didn't, how the hammer sends a message through wood and the wood answers. He said he had felt the cask under his hands before he knew it was there, the way you sense a change in weather against your wrist. The hatbands, Ruth said when asked, were the shape of two men she used to call by their first names and then stopped because time likes its distance. When the room thinned, Maeve walked the edges. The old jukebox, retired to a corner, held a throatful of songs and lost quarters. On a hunch born of nothing rational, she trusts those as long as they don't ask for money. She opened the service panel. There, behind the pulley for the record, arm, a flat packet of pictures wrapped in bar tape, waited like a message to a future that had finally shown up. Polaroids, dull with dust, patient as moth cocoons. She peeled one free. Her thumb found the cold square, the way a reader finds the ribbon in a long book. The little mechanism inside the plastic let out its soft click and the picture slid forward. She fanned it in front of the fan as Ruth had done years ago, granting the ghost its air. In the corner of the frame, a brim leaned against the lip of an open cask. On the shining ring that fastened staves to staves, the faintest hint of a sleeve. Returned a sliver of light dark cloth, and at the cuff a pale seed, round and moonlike. Maeve watched the image gather itself from milk into a memory and held her breath, not to decide what it meant, only to witness the moment when the past agreed, finally, to be seen. The room waited. Morning took Riverton by the shoulders and gave it a small shake, the kind that loosens dust from curtains and worries from habits. And Maeve Rio set out with a notebook that liked to keep its own counsel and a patience learned from engines that do not start on the first turn, walking the streets as if the town were a long sentence she meant to read aloud. Each porch and shop front a comma, each remembered face a pause where feeling lives, and the Wind River keeping time at her elbow, with its soft ongoing hush. She made a map not of roads but of voices, because voices tell you where the ground will hold. Ruth Delgado came first, because she was both witness and weather, because a bar has the memory of a church and the housekeeping of a ship. They stood by the sink where years of glasses have taught the water to keep quiet. Ruth did not need urging. What she had not said had grown heavy in her pockets. She told Maeve that on that night in '83, after the toasts cooled and the jukebox grew brave with old songs, Harlan went down to the cellar to get air, a phrase that had lived in her ear like a splinter because air is not stored in basements, and after a minute or two, there came a single dull thud, not violent, not loud, but the kind of sound wood makes when it remembers it was once a tree. She had wiped her hands on her apron and then not moved, because sometimes not moving is how a person listens, and when Harlan came up his hands were scrubbed pink and his voice took the long way around ordinary words. The memory put a shine on her eyes. She put a towel over one shoulder, like armor against nothing you can see. Paper has its own weather. In a drawer beneath the register, Maeve found a deposit slip from that week in '83, closed out far later than Ruth's habit would allow. In the margin, a thin smear the color of roofwork, a little bruise of pitch that did not belong in a drawer where math lives. Across town, in a shop that smells of resin and strings, the widow of a luthier remembered selling a block of colophony to a man who paid in cash and left no name. She kept the carbon slip only because she keeps everything that can be folded. It had the date circled in a neat grief. On her counter, a single violin read the room with its quiet spine, as if it knew that some bow somewhere had leaned into rosin truth until it sang Pastor Ezekiel. Ward met Maeve on the parsonage steps, where geraniums had the color of stubborn cheer and the paint on the railing had been refreshed more recently than whatever he believed. He spoke about second chances as if the phrase were a blanket, and he laid it over the whole town, and then over Harlan in particular. And when Maeve asked him whether he had seen the man that night, he answered yes, their talk brief and private. A reminder from him that confession benefits from winter light. Harlan had listened like a man who could not find the tune, and then he had left, and the pastor had wrapped his coat tighter, because you rarely feel the cold until someone else leaves you standing in it. Franklin Cordell at the yard liked to move words around the way he moved metal. with a crowbar and a shrug. He greeted Maeve with the false hospitality of men who collect other people's broken things, recited his bingo alibi with the glee of a man whose luck had finally paid $3, and lifted the lid of a cardboard box to show the stubborn toaster he had never unboxed because winning is better before it is used. He teased, he baited, said the town liked heroes until they tidied too much, and then he mentioned, like a coin he had forgotten to spend, that on the night everybody still talks about, headlights idled near the Fremont Bridge long enough to look like thinking. He scratched his jaw and asked if there was a reward for noticing. Maeve thanked him without promising the kind of reward he meant. Claudine Vega had put her anger in a jar and loosened the lid. In the hospital in Casper, she had sat a long night with a mother who bargained with fever. She confirmed dates and times with the precise pride of the accused, but her eyes carried a reef of old Hans, and she could not help saying that Jack Teller was the kind of man who wanted to clean the room so thoroughly that he would mop footprints while people were still standing on the floor. That kind of cleaning, she said, makes men nervous who like the dirt arranged just so. Her voice softened on his name despite herself. Not all resentments survive their own remembering. Noah McCready called from the bar because a carpenter is a translator between wood and human stubbornness, held the Polaroid to the light and described the barrel they had opened as if it were a clock stopped under a lake, sealed with rosin that smelled faintly of stage curtains and Christmas, sweet and resinous, the way a violin bow leaves your hand sticky with a note that refuses to leave. And he said that wood keeps time differently than people do, boards counting by winters and summers, and barrels by what they are asked to keep. Dr. Wexler arrived late to that part of the day and inspected the pile of evidence with his hands in his pockets and his grin in timeout. He said, with the shrug of a man who has ruined cakes, that the inventory felt like a recipe that fails because someone swapped salt for sugar. All the measures correct and the bite utterly wrong. Maeve laughed despite herself and then stopped, because laughter is a fragile instrument and does not like to be played over a closed door. Back at the saloon, the Polaroid went to the county technician whose delight in glass and shadow is very nearly a vocation. He cleaned it with breath and cloth, turned it under a lamp as tenderly as Ruth turns a memory, and then he showed them what reflection had kept. Along the bright metal hoop that cinches staves to barrel, a ghost of a sleeve came back, darkness, worrying its cuff, a narrow stain where tar might have flirted with cloth, the brim pressed to the lip of the cask as if hats could listen. And, almost comic if it had not been so human, a pale circle the size of a sunflower seed near the edge where a hand might rest. When a man is deciding something and forgetting to hide the evidence of his hunger, the picture did not accuse. It only refused to look away. The day went long. The river widened, as rivers do when you ask them questions. Maeve walked the block to the bridge with the steadiness of someone who has learned that momentum is not the same as hurry. At the rail, wind ruffled her notes. She read the town story back to itself, the thud in the cellar, the request for rosin, the pitch on the boot, the late register, the pastor's winter council, the headlights that lingered where Warner and roads speak a private language, and she felt, the way you feel a change in weather, that the next sentence must be written in mud. She made the calls that move heavy things. The county answered with equipment and men who knew the difference between lifting and disturbing. A flatbed brought a winch that looked like a promise built out of patience and steel. Deputies set cones as if choreographing a minor mercy. Ruth arrived with a thermos because some scenes ask for coffee like others ask for prayer. Wexler walked the bank and told the river to be generous for once. It did not answer, but it did not disagree. Night set up its lamps. The dredge cable unspooled with the old song rasp of braided metal, and the hook went down past reflection into the part of water that keeps opinions. Men in vests spoke in the voices people use when saying a person's name might wake him. The excavator coughed, then settled into a working breath. Maeve stood with her palms flat on the rail, feeling the town's pulse gather there. everyone waiting in a shared pocket of hope and dread that smelled of silt and diesel and last year's leaves. Somewhere a dog barked once and then minded its business. The star on the evidence table, far away now and still near, carried its scratched apology into the dark. When the operator signaled ready, the winch took the first bite of strain. The line straightened, tightened, sang its thin iron song across the black water, and with a clean, decisive snap of tension that traveled through the bridge boards and up the bones of everyone listening, the cable went to work. The line held, and the town held with it. A hush stretched between shore and water like a long-held note. Children pulled close against coats, men with their hands in pockets they did not need, women with thermoses warming what nerves could not. And Maeve quiet at the rail, saving words for when they might count, while Dr. Wexler, who feared silence the way some men fear mirrors, muttered that if the Wind River had a conscience, it would cough up its secrets with bedside manners and let everyone go home before their toes forgave them. The winch answered with its own voice, an iron hymn, and the cable drew a darker line across the black surface until something below agreed to move. First it was only bubbles and the shift of mud, the smell of old leaves and iron waking. Then a dull shape shrugged itself free of the bottom like a memory deciding to return, and the water took on the sickly sheen that machines bleed when they are done with pretending. A roof came up, paint long surrendered, a window rim with one stubborn triangle of glass, and then the wide mouth of a grill that once believed it was handsome. The river made room for a Ford Ltd. 1978, hauled by inches until the bank had to accept it. People read the plates the way you read a telegram. The numbers and letters were still themselves. Someone said Sully Parmenter before anyone official did, because every town has a mouth that gets there first. They pried the doors with a bar, and the door sighed like a barn in wind. The inside smelled of lake sleep and something chemical that outlasts shame. In the back seat lay a service jacket, name patch cracked but legible, a shape still folded into the shoulders. In the glove box, wrapped like a promise you do not intend to keep, a small package tight with black tape that worried everyone's hands, the powder inside fine as gossip. On the passenger seat, damp but stubborn, a map with routes marked in. A quick, efficient hand, an X pinned over Viejo Molino, the old mill dock where trucks dreamt of being ships. There were no bodies. There were no bones. Even the river looked embarrassed. The cheer that tried to rise died politely. What came out was relief's thinner cousin, followed by that ache particular to almost answers, the way a syllable can break inside the mouth and become only breath. Wexler said the river had given them an outline and kept the story, and Ruth, who had come to stand with the others because sometimes standing is all people can do together, said under her breath that outlines are for plans, not grief. Maeve took notes that did not judge because ink has to mind its manners. She traced connections without forcing them to marry. The car linked forward and backward at once. The map and the powder turned the air to old news, Marcus Hale's network. The dock logistics, the routes that pretended to be innocent until the receipts said otherwise. Sully, who used to watch the water pretend to be a mirror, left town in 1984 without telling anyone who deserved to know. A photograph years later had him squinting into sun in El Paso, the way men squint when they have not rested in a long while. All of it was motion around a stillness. None of it put Harlan or Jack in the front seat or in the trunk or anywhere a human answer belongs. Back at the buck and rail, evidence laid itself out on a table as if it wanted to be polite. Maeve stood with the habit of people who solve by subtracting, and the pieces rearranged themselves like furniture you have moved before. The rosin inside the cask, the pitch at the bottom, sweet pine and tar. They did not explain a car asleep in river mud. They explained something sealed where smell and damp could not betray it. The cask belonged to a different storyline running under the floorboards, parallel to the one the river had just tried to sell them. The instrument shop slip, saved by a widow who saves paper the way some save string. Had a signature the first time no one cared to read, a gray, the ledgers at Hobson's Feed and Hardware, place that knows who is fixing roofs and who is fixing themselves, showed the same. Name buying pitch, then pitch again, and sunflower seeds in sacks that made the clerk joke about birds with appetites. Patterns want to be recognized. Maeve felt the nudge at her ribs that means a map is clearing its throat, on a road that does not have room for hurry. The mail carrier who owns the miles between town and pasture leaned on his wheel and passed along what roads learn. The man who signs a gray on order slips lives out by Crowheart Butte, turns bills due into conveniences, and as a small, odd kindness to the world, he straightens the flyers in his mailbox so their corners line up, even when the wind has already decided to misbehave. It was nothing you could write on a warrant. It was everything you could write in a margin. Ruth heard about the name and snorted, because names deserve a little style. She said a man hiding himself ought to try harder than using the color of the sky when it is tired. Gray, she said, rolling the word like a marble between her teeth. Next he'll be Mr. Blue. Her humor was not unkind. It was the sort you use when fear needs a chair and won't take one unless you make it laugh first. Maeve put the map of the day down beside the map from the glove box and looked at how the lines refused to cross. The car gave her Halle and Sully and the Viejo Molino. The cask gave her rosin and pitch and a habit of order that keeps pictures straight in leaflets. Aligned, one trail shouted with commerce and the other whispered with craft. She knew in her bones which one the truth prefers. She packed the Polaroid, because pictures like to go where they will be asked again, and took the road that climbs away from water into country where fences measure distance and patience. The land toward Crowheart Butte wore its red-brown like an old bruise that the light was learning to forgive. Sage made the air sharp and medicinal. Cottonwoods followed the creek like loyal dogs. The sky did that Wyoming thing where it looks as if it began earlier than other skies and means to go on after. Maeve drove with both hands soft on the wheel and her mind steady on the smallness of the thing she hunted. Not a headline, not a confession screamed, but a habit, a tick. The way a person's need for straight lines can give him away when he has spent too much of his life keeping crooked things from falling. The mailbox was a plain tin mouth with a red tongue raised. Inside, glossy sheets from the Hardware, a church notice about pies, a feed catalog, all standing crisp and exact. Corners squared as if a ruler had visited. Gravel popped under her tires like corn thinking about it. The yard beyond had the indecision of places kept by one person, some tasks finished to the last screw, others abandoned in an honest circle of tools. A pale dust of resin clung to the sill of a shed window the way summer freckles the shoulder of a child. By the porch, a bucket with tar brush laid on top had cooled into a modest monument. He came into view not by drama but by continuity, as if the house had always included him in its measurements. A man in a work shirt paused at the mailbox and did his small, loyal thing. He lifted the stack, tapped it against his palm until it spoke the language of right angles, and slid it back in, satisfied by what most would never notice. He turned, perhaps to fetch a tool, perhaps only to agree with the afternoon, and the eyes that met the road were not invented by any alias. They belonged to Harlan Crow, aged by wind and choice, the color of a man who has spent years inventing honest chores to keep hands from remembering. The porch hinge sounded itself low. Complaining metal, the most ordinary of announcements, as he opened the door and stood there, half in, half out, exactly the way a life stands when it has postponed its reckoning as long as it can and finds, at last, that the day does not intend to be postponed. He stood in the doorway as if the house had grown him, not startled so much as resigned, a man who had practiced being found and now rehearsed the part of it happening. The yard kept its own council sage rough at the edges, a windbreak of poplars. Doing their narrow shiver, the red ribs of Crowheart Butte laid against the sky like a hand that had decided to stop closing. A shovel leaned by the barn with a patience that tools learn. The barn itself smelled of rope, mice, and hay that remembered better summers. Maeve took in the tidy ruts of a wheelbarrow, the bucket crusted with pitch by the porch boards planed smooth by a single set of boots. She greeted him with the soft authority of someone who knows that loud questions scare true answers back into their holes. Harlan Crow said her name as if it had always belonged on this road. He asked if it had to be a long talk and offered coffee, with the thrift of a host who has been alone long enough to forget ceremony. Inside, the kitchen was orderly in the way grief gets when it needs something to do. Mugs nested by diameter. Sugar tin turned so the label faced the same direction as the salt, a dish towel folded to a geometry that would have pleased a surveyor. He poured without asking how much, because a kind of politeness wears out when there are no guests to argue with you. She took the mug and mentioned, "Rosin, as you would mention a cousin you have in common, casual and precise at once." Said she had seen resin glassed to the inside of a barrel, smelled its particular pine sweetness in a room that remembered November. Asked if he played. He set the kettle aside carefully, the way men set down words they are not ready to handle. "The violin belonged to my father," he said, not answering the question and answering another. "He told me the bow needs a little help to hold on." Maeve said that pitch gives wood away to refuse water and odor, and Harlan nodded like a man who knows about weather more than he knows about sin. Then he pivoted toward the window and the sunflowers leaning there with their black eyes. Said the birds had been greedy this year. Said he saves the seeds for thinking. They sat. The room listened. He described chores no one had asked about. Hinges oiled, fence wire twisted right-handed, a roof patched twice because once is not a number you trust. Maeve allowed him his inventory and then asked about a boy named Evan, and the name lay between them with the weight of something that had been carried too far. Harlan's mouth made a motion that might have been a no and might have been the doughy beginning of a prayer. He said Evan had hands that were good with carburetors and trouble, that he had been young in a way the law does not honor, that second chances had been preached to him by Pastor Ward like rain to dry ground. He asked if anyone had told her that Jack Teller believed in first chances done right, so strongly he did not see the use of a second, and he said it with the respect a stubborn man keeps for the other kind of stubborn. The telephone on the wall rang like a bird that had remembered its voice. Harlan flinched minutely. Maeve answered because authority sometimes means doing the domestic thing. It was Ruth, her voice softened by distance and the memory it carried. She said she had spent the morning interrogating her own recollection, and it had answered with a small, humiliating truth. On the night that will not leave her alone, Harlan washed his hands at the sink downstairs longer than any kitchen asks. Scrubbed them until the skin went pink and the knuckles shook, and he asked for rosin after the bar was closed, as if time could be unmade by the right order of requests. Maeve thanked her, promised to return the call with something kinder than silence, hung up, and turned back to the room. Details staged their own uprising when they realized they have been seen. Maeve noticed the flyers on a side table feed, auctions. A church supper aligned so that their corners formed a single square. The picture frames on the far wall hung true in a way human hands must have insisted upon, each one adjusted half a breath beyond level. She said, lightly, that not many people keep papers so straight in a windy county, and Harlan looked at the frames as if they might tell him what to do. Something in his face gave, not a collapse, more like a stitch breaking in a hem that had been taken in too tight. He tried the charity of smaller lies. Said he had come out here to mind land that wasn't worth a quarrel. Said he had a temper for mess but none for malice. The coffee cooled. The kettle clicked against its ring with the loneliness of a train heard and unseen. Finally, he set his cup down in the circle of its own ring, aligning handle to plate as if that small obedience might save him. "I did the worst thing," he said, voice quiet as burlap, "for what I thought was the better thing." The sentence did not ask for sympathy and did not deserve it, but it asked to be carried. And Maeve understood that some burdens are lighter when everyone admits their names. Boots sounded on the step and the door eased open. Dr. Hal Wexler arrived, with his bag and a jacket that had made enemies of burrs all the way up the lane. He took in the geometry of the room and the way breath weighed more than furniture, and he made a face at having missed whatever he imagined was the dramatic part. "Did I miss the solo or the coda?" he asked, gentle in his clowning now, and Harlan answered without heat. "The music," and the word did the work of a final chord. Wexler nodded and, for once, let a joke die of natural causes. Maeve placed the Polaroid from the jukebox on the table, the one with the brim leaning to the lip of a barrel and the thin crescent of stain on a sleeve. She set beside it the slip for rosin purchased in cash by a man who signed a gray, and the hardware ledger that mentioned pitch and sunflower seeds 6 times in a season that had no use for abundance. She did not say that the seed shell visible in the reflection looked like a moon teaching itself to be small. She did not have to. Harlan looked until not looking would have been the lie too far. He told her about work, how his father taught him that wood is a conversation. If you listen to it, it will tell you where it wants to be joined and where it refuses to bear weight. How the same is true of people and promises. How some nights you cannot tell the difference between holding and hiding until morning, and by then morning is a judge without mercy. He spoke as if he were building not a defense but a bridge to two. The last decent version of himself. Maeve let the words make their shape and did not step on them. The barn door thumped in a small wind, and the shovel by its jamb seemed to lift its shadow. Harlan rose with the caution of a man who has been waiting for the exact posture of this moment, went to the peg where an old denim jacket hung sleeves brushed, collar squared, and put it on like an oath that still fits. He asked if they would come with him, not as prisoners or guards, but as witnesses, and he said a thing that sounded like a man returning borrowed time. That truth needs an address. Maeve stood, so did Wexler, both without grandeur, the way people stand when a service is about to begin, and there is no program. They walked the yard that had been trimmed to the carefulness of penance. Chickens lifted their heads and put them down again, satisfied that nothing in their small empire had changed. The sunflowers tilted under a tired bee. Gravel made its small winter music under boots. Behind the barn, where the ground sank into a bed that had taken more water than the rest, the air changed temperature by a breath, a cool pocket where the day hesitated. Harlan stopped and touched the shovel's worn handle as if taking someone's hand. He did not speak to the earth. He did not pray. He only squared his feet the way he must once have squared frames behind a bar, fixed the angle of the blade with the accuracy of an old habit, and drew a long, steady breath, as if air might finally be where it belongs. When iron met ground, it did so with a bright, ordinary ring metal on soil, the first syllable of a sentence the land had been refusing to say. The first shovel bite rang bright and ordinary, then softer, then dull, and the earth, which had held its breath too long, let go until the spade slid like a page being turned. The smell was cellar-cool and iron-sweet. When the square was deep enough to kneel, Maeve touched the ground as you touch a fevered brow, and Harlan stood 1 pace back, hat in his hands. They worked deliberate, speaking only when needed, until the outline of a man who had been counted on appeared in the gravity of the pit. A band of gold still circled bone where a promise had lived. A thin shine still lived in the ring, a stubborn, circle-catching light that had traveled so far to find it. The few neighbors who had followed the truck stood with arms folded against the wind, and let the silence be the first and most decent speech. The ground, having told the truth, seemed at last to relax. Wexler said, quietly, that some stories have no pulse, but deserve a heartbeat of respect. Ruth arrived with a blanket and did not lay it over anything. Holding it was enough. When the van took Jack to people who would name him again with tender precision, when the first papers began building their thin scaffolds, Harlan asked to speak, and did not ask to sit. He began with the night everyone kept stored. Marcus Halley had money and leverage and a particular interest in a boy named Evan who had stumbled carrying someone else's poison. Harlan had raised him like a second triad. being a brother. The offer came dry and tempting, cash if the charge could be softened. He took the envelope not for the bills, but to spare a first mistake. He hated how light the paper felt. He told how Jack saw it. Jack had a gift for straight lines. In the cellar that smelled of apples and old rain, Jack uncovered what Harlan could not carry. No shouts, only two men trying to find a thread. Jack said he would go to the prosecutor at daybreak. Harlan asked for time. Jack stepped toward the stairs. Harlan reached without thinking. The floor, kissed with pitch from a repair, slicked his boot. His temple met the iron ring of a barrel. The room made a single, final sound. No struggle. No time left for forgiveness to cross the room. Panic grows hands. Harlan did what people do when they cannot undo. He cleaned what he could, washed until his knuckles stung, and reached for the only controls left: containment and time. He smeared rosin along staves and seams. He ran pitch across the bottom, like a dared line. He lowered the hat he could not bear to see and the star he could not bear to wear. And with something sharp he scratched, per the name, G, on the back of the badge. He sealed, he lifted, he hid. Then he walked out of his own name and into an alias plain as weather. A gray. The townspieces turned and clicked. The Polaroid explained the brim at the lip of an open cask and the seed shell in the ring's shine. The register closed late because the night had been stretched by disaster. Rosin and pitch explained why the barrel kept silence. The mail carrier's note about squared leaflets explained how hiding leaves fingerprints. Evan left town with cash that burned through every pocket it tried. He made the county line and then more and grew a quiet life. Safe mistakes, small wages, a garage that smelled of oil and rain, a daughter who once drew a sunflower so exact it hurt to look. Harlan said he had saved the boy and in doing so had misplaced himself. He had set out to pay one debt and found another that charged interest daily in weather and silence and the straightening of every crooked thing he passed. Riverton did what places do when the wind brings a bell note from far water. People gathered along the rail by the bridge and in the buck and rail where memory keeps a stool. Someone lit a candle and then 20 more. Men who seldom pray took off their hats and did not pretend it was faith. Ruth carried Jack's star with both hands as if it might break. Noah McCready, who understands wood and the boxes it becomes, had made a small case from walnut, the corners joined like fingers that mean to hold on. Pastor Ward said justice travels in winter shoes, arriving late in scuff, and that late is still not never. Maeve said that truth does not absolve. It arranges. Grief is the same size, but the furniture moves so people can walk through. A Taram can learn its own floor plan and stop bumping the same shins at night. She looked over the room that had been a courtroom and a chapel and saw life already finding spaces around the absence. On the wall behind the register, a new photograph hung in a frame a breath off level, and no one reached up to fix it. Some mercies are better left a little crooked. Wind from the river turned pages that were not there. Harlan did not resist the hands that took him. When the cuffs closed, he flinched at the click, a small sound like the end of a sentence. He looked past the door to the long line of cottonwoods and beyond them to a patch of ground where sunflowers kept watch. He bowed his head the way men bow in barns so they will not hit the beam. He let himself be led. Jack went home the way facts go home, slowly at first, then all at once, as his people gathered to say his name until it fit the air again. After the papers, the hearings, the signatures, after the candles were folded into drawers and the bar washed courage out of its glasses, life returned, not as before, but as itself adjusted. The buck and rail opened each evening. Ruth counted the till as if it were a lullaby. Noah patched the floor not to hide history but to carry it without buckling. Wexler told one foolish joke too many and then too fewer. Pastor Ward learned to say, "I don't know," in a tone that turned it into a kind of prayer. The empty peg by Jack's door at home kept being a sentence that did not require words. The Wind River kept on with its music no one wrote. Over stones it made a high note. Under cottonwoods it hummed low. Some evenings Maeve walked there with a thermos and the quiet pleasure of tasks finished honorably, and thought about how some cases end not with triumph but with the dignity of names correctly spoken. On a shelf in her kitchen, among the county fair mugs, a new one from the Buck and Rail found its place, not as a trophy but as a reminder that some stories end on the right chord. Not every town is given an answer. Some vanishings are weather with no map. But here a place learned the spelling of its absence and the arrangement of its sorrow, and people who will never agree on much and will always agree on. Ruth's Chili moved their chairs a little closer and listened better. Harlan's fields grew without him. Evan's daughter learned the names of tools. Jack's name took the echo out of certain rooms and left them usable again. There is a night, and there is the end of it. In the bar that keeps the past on tap, a star sleeps in its wooden box and a frame leans a breath off true. And the light that lands there is honest about the distance between what we owe and what we pay, and still warm. Truly,